Okay, so we're going to kick off this panel now. This panel is on, if everyone could take the seats, please. If everyone can take the seats before I lose my voice. We're going to talk on this panel about developments and merger theory. And in particular, we're going to be talking about ecosystems. But we're also going to be covering the cases, other cases around ecosystem on platforms. Can everyone take their seats, please, or leave the room, one or the other? And we're going to be talking a little bit about some of the more recent developments in cases, including the Vodafone 3 case, which is a very timely case. And maybe if we have time, we'll talk about Illumina Grail and also some of the concerns around roll-ups and how they should be dealt with. So I've got a great panel here. I'll start with Diane on the far side. Diane Coyle is the Professor of Public Policy at University of Cambridge. Guillaume Loriot is the Deputy Director-General at Mergers at DG Comp. Martijn Snoep is the Chairman in the Netherlands Authority for Consumers and Markets, the ACM. Nathan Soderstrom is the Associate Director for Merger Analysis in the Bureau of Competition, FTC. And then Mike Walker is the Chief Economist at the CMA. So we'll start on ecosystems. And there have been clearly a number of significant high-profile cases in the last year or so involving companies that either own a platform or are some part of an ecosystem. So some of the cases include Microsoft Activision, Amazon iRobot, Adobe Figma, and of course there's the Booking eTravelly case decision. And in many of these cases we've seen kind of tentative theories of ecosystem competition and concerns that the mergers will either enforce or create an ecosystem that will make it harder for competitors to compete within. So for example, just to give you a couple of examples, in Microsoft Activision, there was a concern that Microsoft's purchase of Activision would result in exclusivity, enhancing its position in consoles while reducing that of other consoles and making it harder to compete. Actually, Adobe Figma was a kind of an interesting one because there the ecosystem consideration was used to motivate a potential theory of killer acquisition. So the theory, I think, was that Figma's product design offering might evolve into a threat to Adobe's creative tools, and that actually because Adobe had this ecosystem around these tools, that gave it a particularly strong incentive to build a new product and innovate absent the merger. So what you see here, though, is a general concern that when mergers have an impact on ecosystems, we may be missing something just by looking at the kind of standard economic models of foreclosure, i.e. bundling, vertical foreclosure. So I'm going to kick off by asking Diane whether we're missing something here by simply looking at these ecosystem and platform cases as kind of standard foreclosure cases. Do we need new theories of ecosystem harm? And what does the economic literature kind of tell us about these theories?
So I'm going to get to your question, but in a slightly roundabout way, because I only have one foot in the competition bubble, and a lovely bubble it is too. But a lot of my work at the moment is much more on productivity and growth and supply-side issues and industrial policy. And so when I was thinking about this question of ecosystem theories of harm, it struck me that in the context of industrial policy, ecosystems are generally seen as a good thing, not something that causes harm. Sometimes there's different language, global production networks or supply chains, but the ecosystem language is increasingly being used there too. And so that immediately raises the question of, is there some tension? Are ecosystems always good or bad, or is there something different about the different kinds? So one way to think about that is just in terms of supply and demand, and in competition land, we focus on consumer welfare, and if there's an adequately competitive end-user market, well, we think the supply side can sort itself out. But post-2020, there's much less confidence about the supply side for obvious reasons. There are issues of resilience and national interest that came up this morning. And so consequently, also much more focus now on the economics of ecosystems or production networks on the supply side. The location of expertise matters. The ownership of companies starts to be thought of as important for productivity and growth. And there is actually a real dilemma in some of the links in the chain of these global production networks or ecosystems. And I've labeled it in one of my articles, Adam Smith's Dilemma. So I'm sure you've all read Wealth of Nations. And Adam Smith believed that general opulence required two things. One was a division of labor and increasing specialization. And that meant that markets had to be increasing in scope, because if you can make 10,000 pins rather than 10 pins a day, your market better be growing. But the other was competition, and there's a famous quote about all of the producers not being in this out of self-interest, not out of the general interest, but out of self-interest. Now, in some of these value chains, the specialization has reached such a fine degree that the globally efficient number of producers is just one or two for these particular links. And some of those examples are very well known. So TSMC we've been talking about, and there's this effort to start producing more advanced chips in other countries than Taiwan. But many others emerged during the COVID pandemic. And one of my favorites from reading a history of BioNTech was that they had to get bioactive materials to the only producer who could put them into the little vials needed to inject them, who happened to be in Northern Ireland. And this was at a time when in the rest of the UK we couldn't ship meat to Northern Ireland because of the Brexit debate, so somehow that had to happen. So that's one way to think about tensions in ecosystems, good or bad. The other lens is the dominance of US big tech companies, of course, and so ecosystems is usually a digital conversation. One of the big dictionaries just made enshittification their word of the year. And I think we're probably all familiar with the way that many of the platforms are gradually degrading user experience and extracting additional profits. So we experience it day to day. So if you're a national policymaker in Europe, you'd watch a single US company spending $40 billion or $60 billion a year on the next generation of AI, and you'd have some valid concerns about past enforcement of competition policy in this domain. And so in this area, the apparent tension, ecosystems good or bad, is resolved by the identity of the dominant players. And so the big American tech companies are maybe the ones causing the harms, and in Europe we would like to be able to grow some good ecosystems of our own, including in these markets. So if you look forward, I think it's reasonable to accept that even if the big US companies are going to dominate foundation or generative AI models, which the scale suggests they might, they do need to be prevented from sewing up all of the opportunities, either for commercial growth of AI applications that sit on the foundation models, or for completely new technical approaches, and researchers are starting to work on those, be it energy-efficient chips or small models or different approaches to AI altogether. So I think ecosystems are real. The dominant players talk about them in this way, and it is changing the character of competition because they are changing the markets and the way the market structures operate. Consumers love the experiences that they get from big tech, but those experiences are being degraded. And there are some harms, including future harms, not apparent to consumers immediately. So back to your question, Matthew, can we think about this in the traditional way? And I'm going to argue not, for 4 reasons that we need to extend the thinking. One is that the economic context is so dynamic. We've got the 2 general purpose technology transitions in energy and digital. So the consequences of today's market structures or ecosystem structures for innovation are going to be immense. And the big players are shaping those markets. And that's why we care so much about innovation and creating the headroom for innovation, including very radical changes. Second is that the use of data and the bundling of services traps consumers very effectively. So the pain of switching is going to be high. It's not just the friction of doing it, but also that the experience is less good if you make the switch. The ecosystem is very fluid. They don't necessarily involve ownership or acquisition. It can be smaller stakes. It can be deals of compute access for model access. It can be much less formal cooperation. And that's all harder to analyze using conventional tools. And it just makes entry of any kind extremely difficult. And if you'll forgive the Star Trek analogy, it's like a single human trying to fight the Borg. So if Microsoft sees a promising productivity application of AI that's built on a general model or a foundation model, it can so easily integrate that with its suite rather than letting it grow outside. So I don't think the current approaches to analysis and enforcement will quite do. Not because of the quantum of innovation. Big tech is spending tens of billions of dollars on innovation, but the question is, what are they spending it on? Is it incremental change to their own products rather than innovative products? Who's going to profit from that innovation? Is it Apple or Epic? And where that innovation activity happens, is it going to continue to be on the west coast of the US, or will some of it be around Paris with Mistral? So I think we need theories and tools that will track these dynamics better. Case by case, merger by merger won't do it. I don't know whether strategic status is going to be the enabler for tracking the dynamics in the way that I would like. And I think we need to understand the value of data better, and too many economists are doing elegant theorizing rather than empirics about that. And then there might also be some genuine dilemmas. To go back to the Adam Smith point, there may be some trade-off between static efficiency or quasi-static efficiency and the dynamic perspective of creating value for our own people in our own economies. And Americans will often say, this is just nationalism, as if their own government would never do any nationalism for their own sector. But if we want to grow our digital sector and AI, there's going to have to be some chopping away at that ecosystem undergrowth, and I think in quite a radical way.
Thank you, Diane. Guillaume, if I turn to you, in this area, a key decision has been the Booking.com eTraveli decision, which has generated a huge amount of commentary, and some have represented as a kind of return to the efficiency offense standard. That is, if you have a dominant position, anything that could strengthen that position will make it harder for rivals to compete, and therefore is a loss of competition. And therefore, but the problem with this articulation is that that could equally apply to efficiencies, because if efficiencies make a dominant position stronger, because it's inefficient, it's cost reductions that might make it more difficult to compete, then does that mean that it is anti-competitive? Thus, I'd be interested to hear on your thoughts more generally about ecosystems theories, but also on whether this marks a potential return to an efficiency offense standard, or how do we prevent that?
Okay, I'll try. Although I think we discussed the topic last year, so I'll try not to repeat myself, although I don't remember really what I said. But maybe just to at least one thing that is clear, and I think I said it last year, in terms of how do we, at least as competition enforcers in DG Comp, how do we see the notion of ecosystems? And I'm a lawyer, I'm sorry, but in terms of practical, concrete interpretation of the notion of ecosystem, I think for us, it is not a theory of harm. It is a market reality. It is a market context we have to take into account. It is neither a sword nor a shield. And I'll try to be concrete and practical about that, although I can admit the notion may have many different implications. By the way, beyond digital, you know that in business organization, you use the term ecosystems in many different areas with many different aspects, suppliers, the cluster of suppliers and so on, or politically as well. But it's true that in the merger practice from the EU, we've referred to the notion of ecosystems more recently. I'm not sure it was decisive, frankly, but at least to put some color to the market context. But if I go back to where it comes from, at least from an EU perspective, and I know the case, was the Google Android case. And in the Google Android case, remember, when we did the antitrust case, Google used as a defense, saying, well, the Commission, instead of looking narrowly at markets, should have looked at the competition between ecosystems. So I think it's interesting to remind everyone, because I lived through this case, and then the court came with that very, how should I say, simple but very concrete assessment, saying, well, no, the Commission shouldn't get rid of market definitions. There are different markets in the Android case, as you know, but indeed you should have this, I don't know in English how you would say, but multi-directional, multi-level examination about the complementarities between the markets, because you need to understand, beyond the market definitions, what will be the market dynamics. I think that's it. Is it bad? Is it good? Case by case, we have to examine that. And that's where we come from. I think it's been put very clearly in the market definition notice, to the extent we can be clear in the market definition notice about our approach and how that may have an impact on market definition, but it goes well beyond. It's about a competition assessment. And obviously, I think what you mentioned about digital platforms, we all know. It was also in the special advisor report at the time of Mrs. Vestager, the first mandate, where indeed, some features of digital markets, not all, network effects, customer lock-in in some areas, the importance of data, may magnify the ecosystem effect, and you have to understand this. Now, in practice, what did it mean? In what I know, the cases we had, in some cases, the fact that there was an ecosystem, or one could think that there was an ecosystem to be examined in the context of a transaction, well, there were cases where there was no competition concern raised despite the existence of an ecosystem. One was Amazon MGM, where we concluded, rightly or wrongly, I don't know, but we concluded that the very fact of buying MGM by Amazon would not, how should I say, strengthen the ecosystem of Amazon on the marketplace, because the links were tenuous. There were many factors about that we considered about the MGM's content, how important it can be, would it raise barriers to entry on this type of market. We had Google Photomath, that is not mentioned very often, but I think was very interesting. That is the type of tool that, for lawyers like us, it may be useful, but there are many of them. And the question was one of the questions was whether the very fact for Google to buy this kind of math application tool would strengthen the Google ecosystem, the search system. And we looked at, the classic leveraging in the math application tool, and we could dismiss it easily because we saw previous acquisitions and the importance of this market and the impact. But I think the most important point was that we looked at whether the very fact of buying that type of app would have an effect on Google's position on its core market. Search, essentially. Would it bring more traffic? Was Photomath a very special app with particular specificities? Something that would, one way or the other, generate significant traffic to Google so as to strengthen its position, and then with harmful effects on the markets to be examined, obviously. We looked at that. We dismissed that effect, right? So just one example, again, to show that even if you consider different types of strategies beyond the classic tying bundling, but also the kind of entrenchment theory, as my friends would say, we may adopt them or dismiss them, just to tell you that there's no efficiency offense. Not even our mindset is about an efficiency offense. But I understand that there's a litigation strategy, and then the parties in booking may say, well, there was an efficiency offense. Of course you would, if you have a litigation, and particularly when you haven't, during the case, brought about significant efficiencies, because let's remember, it's for the parties to bring the proof about efficiencies. There was no efficiency claim, as far as I remember, on product efficiencies, of the very fact of buying eTraveli. I don't know if I need to explain again the booking eTraveli case, because we discussed it at length last year. It's still in court. I can sum it up, but essentially, I think you all know it. So thank you for that. There were other cases, indeed, where we considered the ecosystem in Microsoft Activision. When looking at on the nascent segment for cloud gaming, which triggered a big discussion. Remember, but that was the focus of the investigation, not the consoles and so on. There was one part of the assessment. Beyond the classic theory, to look at whether indeed within a PC ecosystem and so on, that would be an additional add-on to strengthen, the stickiness, let's say, the position of that ecosystem. That was part of the concern. We had it also, I think, in Meta Customer at the time, where it was part of the incentive analysis. Why would, the company in CRM, although small, would attracting it in the Meta's ecosystem for messaging and so on. So I think there are various degrees. We are conscious of that market environment. I think it's very important, but that doesn't translate into a theory of harm, at least up to now, and you know, with the cases I had the privilege to work on. So just to, I think, dismiss your concerns about the efficiency offense, I think the very fact that you don't look only into a classic foreclosure theory in the adjacent market, which is the main concern in conglomerate or non-horizontal cases. We keep saying it, and that's true, but there are other types of concerns that may emerge in non-horizontal cases. Potential competition, Adobe Figma, that has nothing to do with foreclosure. Access to information issues, like in energy, we have it in the guidelines, nothing to do with foreclosure. And strengthening of a dominant position on a core market in the context of an ecosystem may be a theory of harm. I hope the court will validate that, but I think it makes a lot of sense. And I think we've read a lot about, you know, critics at some point telling us you should look at these theories seriously. We've done that. In some cases, we've dismissed them, and in others, we've considered that they were demonstrated, and that was the case.
Thank you very much, Guillaume. So it sounds like that in encapsulating the fact that this is not an efficiency offense, the core piece of the core element is that there weren't efficiencies produced in that. If there had been arguments around efficiencies, if there had been a bringing of the efficiencies in a merger, then that might have come to a different decision, because then at that point you're weighing up, well, it may strengthen the ecosystem, but at the same time it may provide benefits, and then you have to kind of weigh those up in a standard framework.
I think it's a bit more subtle than that. I mean, there were some financial efficiencies claimed that we dismissed, and we explained the reasons for that. What I'm just saying is that in a market context where the one of Booking, we think, where the target, you know, it's not any merger by Booking. It's one where they buy, you know, number 2 at the time of the neighboring market that attracts the most traffic in the hotel OTA, in which they have a very dominant position. Then you look at the features of the market, you see that there's a lot of customer inertia, and there's this flywheel effect according to the parties. I mean, then the question is whether it's really an efficiency, and you know, I don't think it is. It's like in a horizontal case where you might have a strengthening of market power through external growth because of market features that, absent any conduct, make you bigger, allow you to have excessive market power, which to me is a damage to competition. It doesn't mean that big is bad. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that because of the features of the market, you can expect barriers to expansion or even entry being raised even further in a context where you see that already the player is extracting more commissions than its competitors. I think that's the story, that's the narrative.
Thank you. Mike, if I turn to you now, many of the cases that were discussed, Adobe Figma, Microsoft Activision, obviously, Amazon iRobot, were also considered at the CMA as well. Can you give us your thoughts on ecosystems, and particularly whether they constitute kind of a new theory of harm, whether they just provide a context that kind of exacerbate our existing theories of harm, or whether do we need a new tool bag in order to consider these?
Okay, so it's not a theory of harm. It's a description of market realities, as just explained. Do we need a new sort of tool bag? Because, of course, a lot of the stuff that we see in ecosystems, in theories of harm within ecosystems are pretty standard. I guess 2 places I'd say where we could always do more research, of course. One is on thinking more about how we can take account of capabilities of firms when we are doing merger control, and in particular, understanding what are the capabilities that the ecosystem firm might be buying that are potentially important and might have an adverse effect on markets, and those that are less important, and for instance, maybe because they're very common. So I think more understanding of capabilities, and then just echoing what Diane said, I mean, way more understanding of the role of data, and particularly of the ability of firms to leverage data across markets. You know, that clearly can be exclusionary. It also clearly can be fantastic for consumers, and I think it'd be great for us to have better understanding there. And I know you didn't ask me this, Matthew, but I don't know why we're all so precious about this concept of an efficiency offence. I mean, the idea that you might have a large firm, ecosystem firm, that goes into another market that has short-run benefits for consumers, but one of the effects of that is it damages long-run competition, and that is harmful long-run, seems to me entirely coherent. If you don't want to call it an efficiency offence, fine, call it David, Harold, whatever. But it is a coherent theory of harm that we shouldn't shy away from.
Thank you, Mike. Nathan, over to you. Perhaps you can give your perspective on the US on ecosystems and platforms and the experience that the US has had.
Yeah, happy to. I'll give the standard disclaimer. I'm here speaking. My views are my own, not those of any commissioner or the commission more broadly. So I think as a general matter, the term ecosystem competition is less likely to come up in the US than it is over here. Agreed, it's a market reality, right? It's not a theory of harm. You tend not to hear the term as much. Part of it might be you have the Digital Markets Act. We, of course, do not. Part of it is I think we're discussing similar concepts, but using potentially different terminology. On the 2023 guidelines, I went back and looked for the term ecosystem. Shows up twice, both in Guideline 6, entrenchment. There, it's around the idea that you might have a dominant incumbent that is constrained by a combination of products and services from one or more firms, in that if the dominant incumbent were to snap up one or more of those products or services, that's supporting nascent ecosystem competition. It may invite Section 7 scrutiny. So it's in the context of a defensive acquisition is where the term shows up in the 2023 guidelines. Guideline 9, which is the platform guideline, also says that mergers involving platforms can threaten competition even when a platform merges with a firm that is neither a direct competitor nor in a traditional vertical relationship with the platform. So probably not dissimilar to the booking case we had over here. Point is, don't use the phrase, but I think certainly an ecosystem concept. On the question of whether, to the extent you asked the question, I think you did, do we have the tools to address this market reality? I think the answer is probably. On the question of will courts come along, I think that's more of a maybe. Meta within, I think, has been thought about as an ecosystem case. Ecosystem concepts, ecosystem color certainly show up in that complaint. The complaint alleges that Meta was a key player at each level of the VR ecosystem, which includes hardware, app distribution, and apps, and that Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg had made clear that his aspiration for the VR space was control of the entire ecosystem. So certainly ecosystem color, again, to that complaint. Now, as far as how we actually pled the case, as far as how we actually argued the case, it was quite a bit more narrow in the sense that we alleged that Within was a current participant in the market for VR-dedicated fitness apps, and that Meta was a potential competitor in that market, and that the merger would lessen both actual potential and perceived potential competition. The court did accept our legal framework there. We, as many folks know, did not quite get there on the facts. But I think the disconnect, to the extent there's a disconnect between how, the ecosystem color or concepts in that complaint and how we actually argued it, speaks to a big challenge we face. We're not unique in facing this challenge, but Section 7 of the Clayton Act, which is our merger statute, prescribes mergers whose effect may be substantially to lessen competition or tend to create a monopoly in a line of commerce. Courts have read line of commerce to mean that the government, the plaintiff, needs to define a market. We have the burden on that question. Our cases, as many of you know, oftentimes rise or fall on the validity of our proposed market definition. So, and we have tools to define markets. As you know, quantitative, we have the hypothetical monopolist test from a qualitative perspective, the brown shoe, practical indicia. But those tools are not necessarily obvious choices to think about an interrelated set of products or services, right? How do you go about defining that? Now, look, I think as Guillaume mentioned, you can think about entrenchment in a core market, and that's certainly a way to think about dealing with ecosystem matters. Again, our entrenchment, guideline 6 of our guidelines, I think is worth thinking about. tend to create a monopoly prong of our Section 7 as a standalone claim, I think is worth thinking about. And I think Section 2 of the Sherman Act, which is our monopolization statute, is worth thinking about as well. Our ongoing Meta case, which alleges that Meta, through the WhatsApp and Instagram acquisitions, was engaged in illegal monopoly maintenance, certainly ecosystem color to that proceeding. Again, but it's a merger case. It's a consummated merger case, but the claim is Section 2 of the Sherman Act. So I think we have tools. I think they are somewhat untested, and what the court treatment of those tools might look like or will look like, that is an open question, but it's something we're thinking about, and I think we'll be continuing to think about.
Thank you very much, Nathan. Finally, Martin, I understand that you've also been thinking about this area, not only in the context of issues such as price, innovation, etc., but also in the area of media plurality in platforms. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that, please.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for CRA for inviting me. But maybe one first comment that also gives a little bit of a different perspective on the debate from a competition authority that's also a consumer protection agency, and that is very close to the consumer in the Netherlands. I think national authorities have a tendency to be a bit closer to the consumer than the European Commission, naturally, is how it works, because we really feel day to day the pressure from consumers through the media, through complaints, etc. And what I like about the discussion that we have is on theories of harm is that we become, as competition specialists, more sophisticated. And that we now take into account a long-term perspective, effects on innovation, on efficiencies, maybe even strategic autonomy. But I would also plead, let's not forget the short term, because the short-term interest of the consumers is something that we have to keep in front of our minds. And the reason for that is that the short-term interest of consumers is also something that provides a stability in our societies that is in a vulnerable stage. We see that around us. And if consumers see their cost of living increasing without adequate compensation in their wages, they will revolt. So it is not something that we can ignore and that we should continue to see. That is not being said that let's ignore the long term. I think it was Keynes who said in the long term we're all dead. No, not. But at the same time that we're talking about kind of more long-term perspective, let's not forget about the short term, and particular short-term price increases for consumers. That second point I'd like to make is that we discuss a lot about the theory, and that comes back to your question on the theory. What is the theory of the effect on competition? But we should also talk about the harm. What are the types of harms that we as competition authorities are concerned with? And I think there we are exploring also new territories. We went for negative effects on innovation, negative effects on labor conditions, negative effects on sustainability, negative effects on animal welfare was in a case that we analyzed under our merger control laws. And now we have a pending case on media plurality. So is the competition, is the restriction of competition, what kind of effect does it have on media plurality? Ultimately necessary in an open and democratic society to the benefit of the consumers. So the third and final point I'd like to make is that, if we look at new theories of harm, it's also fair to also look at new theories of benefits. Because, we cannot only look at one side, we also have to look at the other side. And there, I think I welcome the Draghi report that stimulates competition authorities, the competition community to think about kind of theories of benefits related to innovation. But there may also be other benefits. Think about benefits to sustainability that can outweigh the benefits, the harms that are identified in a different theory. And that I don't have the answer. And it's going to be difficult, and it's a difficult balancing of different interests. But I think that is the task that competition authorities are up to. They have to stand up for that, and they have to make that analysis in an objective and transparent way. for the public, but it is both the harms and the benefits that are of relevance in our kind of modernized merger control approach.
Thank you very much, Martin. So just to sum it up then, it sounds like we've got pretty much a broad consensus that it's not a new theory, ecosystems, but it's rather an important piece of context that can significantly impact the theories of harm that you have and whether you see benefits and costs. Ecosystems may create benefits and harm, which may be short-term and long-term, but actually there's nothing new in this because lots of economic behaviors or mergers will create benefits and harm. And we need to weigh these up, and whether they're going to be harm but not benefits, then that's going to be something that you're going to be concerned about, regardless of what kind of billing or name you call it. Martin, I thought it was interesting you linking together the kind of not only new theories of harm, but also new theories of efficiencies, and in particular the Draghi report. I mean, one of the interesting cases that has just been announced in the UK, at least, has been the Vodafone 3 case, which I think is an interesting case. I will try and provide a quick summary of that case, but Mike can correct me if I'm wrong, although I've run this past him before, so hopefully I'm not wrong. The case was cleared largely on the basis of a commitment remedy to invest in network capacity and a divestment of spectrum to a capacity-constrained competitor, O2, from the parties, and also short-term behavioral remedies designed to address any kind of short-term harm before the network capacity increase comes into play. And the theory here was essentially that by the parties increasing capacity, the CMA considered that this would increase competitiveness between the merged entity and rivals, and therefore increase competition. Hopefully that's a fair summary. Yep. So let me just turn to you first, Mike, and start by saying that I've seen quite a lot of commentators becoming very excited about this as hailing this as a movement towards the CMA promoting growth, becoming perhaps less interventionist. I've had clients ask me if big mergers are back on the table. So there seems to be lots of excitement about this. Is this a one-off merger? Is this heralding the way that the CMA is going to be thinking about growth in the future? Or yes, let me turn to you, Mike.
Okay, I should probably do my disclaimer at this point. Obviously, I'm speaking on my own behalf, not on behalf of CMA. I'm really sorry to disappoint you all, but this is a really boring standard merger. What you've got, okay, so it's a 4-3 merger, fine, significant loss of competition, but it's a merger with very substantial, longer-term efficiencies, largely scale and scope efficiencies in network rollout, leading to much greater capacity and therefore much greater quality and speed in the counterfactual than without the merger. So it's a merger that I don't think should cause any thinking around, as I've heard, it's a paradigm shift. It's not a paradigm shift. We've had the efficiency defence in merger control since forever. You can certainly argue the competition authorities have been a bit rubbish at using it. I think that is an entirely fair comment, and I've said that many times before. But in this case, I think it's all pretty standard.
But does this... I'm going to come back to you on this one.
I thought you might.
Does this herald... so as you said, competition authorities have not been great about taking account of efficiencies. This does seem to be, relatively new in that, I mean, it's not just thinking about efficiencies, it's efficiencies that are committed and mandated through the remedies. But does this mean that efficiencies are going to play a stronger role in mergers going forward in the UK?
I mean, it depends what mergers come to us. I mean, what do you need to have a reasonable efficiency defence? You need to have decent evidence of verifiable mergers that are actually going to have an effect on competition. That's precisely what we've got. And these are the archetypal marginal cost efficiencies. They are going to dramatically lower the cost of increasing capacity and therefore providing speed and quality. So, is entirely within the framework. Now, I mean, there's also this discussion about, is the CMA suddenly all going all behavioural in its remedies? Yeah. And I sort of see that this is a behavioural remedy in the sense that, we're saying to a firm, you must, do this network build out. But it's not a behavioural remedy in the normal sense. Normally, we hate behavioural remedies because you have to monitor them, and then as soon as you stop monitoring them, the firms stop adhering to them. This is a remedy that changes the cost structure of the industry. So once that rollout has happened, there's no monitoring to be done, the rollout has happened, and the cost structure of the industry will have been changed, and whatever the firms want to do, they will not be able to stop themselves compete against each other. That's what happens when you've got really low marginal costs. So, is it a one-off? Well, let's see what other mergers come to us. Is it a little bit special that we happen to have a regulator who can provide the technical expertise around monitoring the rollout? Absolutely, and that's in our remedies notice that's a relevant factor. But is there some idea that the CMA is now suddenly going to be going out there looking to find remedies and clear them on efficiency defences that they previously wouldn't have cleared them on? I don't think that's right.
Thank you, Mike. Let me turn to Guillaume and ask whether this type of commitment, a commitment to increase capacity, to increase competitiveness, has also been considered in any of the EC cases, and if firms have come to you with, or come to the Commission with kind of commitments to increase capacity as a potential solution.
So, I mean, it's a delicate topic. I don't want to comment. I don't know the facts of the case, so I don't want to make an assessment on the case as such, on the merger as such. We've seen many, telecom mergers, and I'll come to that. I think there are different topics. There's the question of remedies that you just asked, and then there's the question of the substantive assessment, efficiencies. How do you assess them? What consequences can you draw from different market features, notably in telecom markets? So if I take them in turn, it should be the other way, but I think first there's the issue of remedies, because I think our policy has been quite clear for the last, at least in our remedies notice since 2008-9, after the remedies study we had, and we had these long discussions, in recent years about some cases. So I just want to make that clear again. The principle in merger control is structural remedies are the preferred by far option to solve a competition concern. Why? Structural change to the market. So structural remedy, making sure that the markets work, and that's a question also of incentives for the parties. The exception being non-structural remedies with a big distinction. The distinction being that for remedies that consist in access remedies, a kind of access to infrastructure, interoperability, this kind of access, opening up the markets, they can be considered. They can't be, according to the case law, dismissed up front. Mm-hmm. They have to be looked at, assessed, and it's true that we have accepted that type of access remedies in several cases recently and for years. In certain types of cases, with a narrow set of circumstances. So in some cases, you've heard about cases like, Google Fitbit, Microsoft Activision, Broadcom VMware, and so on. Cases where we thought that the area of concern was quite targeted. There was a market practice, interoperability. Typically, the market, was positive. A set of circumstances where, despite the fact that it's not structural as such, quasi-structural, rather access remedies, we have some comfort. And there are other cases where we've rejected them. Booking again, Illumina Grell, it for other reasons, but the substance was quite interesting, or NVIDIA ARM. Why? Because, there was a multiplicity of issues, the market was not, we try to be transparent and objective and apply that policy, which is not easy. But, that is the exception. If you look at the number of cases per year, it's 3 out of 20 or something like that. And then there's the other type of remedy that we reject, purely behavioral remedies, price caps, and so on. I'll come back to that in the context of an investment remedy. And, that is clear in our notice, and that comes from, knowledge we have gathered for years. Now, I'll come to the issue, but then there's the real question to me about the debate on the substance, whether you have a competition concern or not, depending on whether efficiencies might offset that competition issue. I think that's what Mike mentioned about the case now. And it's a difficult trade-off. There are some principles that our court has confirmed about the burden of proof on parties, but verifiability, likelihood, that you need one way or the other, and consumer benefit in the market where there's harm. So, to me, competition in principle is a driver for competition. So obviously, when there's a loss of that competition, there's a problem, and we've seen in most cases in telecoms that indeed, there was competition, including on the rollout on investment. And that competition you want to maintain. We've seen it recently in the Orange MásMóvil case. We've seen it in other cases. And we had cases, because there were many cases. We always show, 30 or something. One case that is, I think, where it was a bit exceptional, where we didn't see that type of competition because the target was not investing in the past and was not likely to invest in the future. And we had good evidence, was the Dutch case, which has been controversial, DT buying Tele2. Tele2 had a 5% market share, and rightly or wrongly, we didn't see that it would bring competition forward in the market, and we had to draw the consequences, and we cleared it. That was heavily criticized, but I still think that we did the right choice in terms of the evidence we had. We had no evidence of that company bringing competition on investment, notably, and innovation and rollout and so on. So we had to draw the consequences, whereas in others, and most of them, when it was head-to-head competition, 4-3, we intervened one way or the other, and I can come back to that as well. Now, to me, there's a difficult trade-off. Either, the efficiency is justified, and has to be very clearly justified, because, if the investment makes sense, is profitable, is verifiable, will benefit consumers, over the long period, then there's no need for a remedy. Then you have to accept it. You have to draw that consequence. That's a very hard choice, but you have to take responsibility for that. And I think that's what we would do if we would see that efficiencies. In practice, in the big financial platform cases, Deutsche Börse, or cross-margining, Orange MásMóvil, where we saw some efficiencies, in practice, they never compensated completely the competition harm. Rollout in some local areas would not compensate the price increase for the whole of the country, 10%, 7%, whatever. So that's, I think, a very difficult trade-off. Because indeed, if the investment doesn't make sense, it's not, it may create inefficiencies in my view, to impose something that is not foreseen. It may create, the wrong type of investment decision that depends heavily on whether, the market circumstances are still there, may change, they may develop. And the experience we have, and then if they change in 5 years and 6 years, what do? You revoke the merger? You can't do much. And I'm saying that just because we had that experience. We had that experience in 2002. I wasn't here. I wasn't here, but we had it later, where there was an investment remedy in the energy sector. It's well known, I think, where there was a promise to invest in the interconnector between France and Spain in energy to increase capacity. It never happened because market circumstances happened to evolve, rightly or wrongly. The Commission had to waive it. And I think this French interconnectors is well known in the energy world because there's not enough interconnection generally. So that is something that we've taken very seriously. I think it happened some years later, and after there was the remedies notice. So to me, there's a genuine question as really, can you, for the next 10 years, secure and regulate investment? Now, if that's, like Mike is saying, is more ensuring that the efficiency is likely, then to me, it's likely in the first place or it's not, and then you have to draw the consequences. So I can see it's a very difficult trade-off. And I think there was an excellent article by John Vickers recently on should competition monopolize merger policy. I happen to quote John Vickers very much lately, where he said, well, serious consideration must be given to the incentive effects of the trade-offs. And I think that's the whole difficulty of remedies, is to make sure that you keep the incentives to compete and not, over-regulate the market. So I think that's our difficult tasks. I don't want to be in these shoes. I can see that it's a difficult choice, but I think that would be my position, at least from my perspective, in that type of case.
Thank you, Guillaume. I'm just going to turn, lastly on this topic, to Diane, because I know that you had some thoughts with respect to investment in capacity and the implications of that.
Just very briefly, I mean, not on the detail of any cases, but in general, it seems to me that we could give much more thought to the incentive effects of the financial structures of mergers. We've got a lot of experience in the UK of essentially financial transactions, highly leveraged bidders acquiring care homes, water companies, whatever. They don't have any interest in running the assets they acquire or the interest of the consumers. And so why would you not, when faced with that kind of merger, think very hard about what are the incentive effects arising from the financial structures that those acquirers are bringing to the merger?
Thank you. And Mike, I don't know if you want to come back on anything, or should we want to move on to the next one?
I mean, I'll be 30 seconds. Look, I mean, everything Guillaume says is entirely reasonable. It's decision-making under uncertainty. And I mean, on the facts, this is a merger that we thought is a good merger, but I don't think anybody on the panel making the decision thought it was, an easy decision to make.
So we'll move on to the next topic, conscious of time, on roll-ups. And this is a particular issue when you see an acquisition which is part of a series of acquisitions in the market over time. And it's a particular issue if none of the mergers meet any sort of jurisdiction threshold, or they just simply fly under the radar because they're too small. But when you take across the series of transactions, then you may actually have a significant change in the competitive structure. And so there's a question here about, do we have a bit of a gap in our merger tools? And this is a strategy that's often associated with private equity industry, which you might have just mentioned, Diane. So I'll turn first to Martin, as I know this is an area which the ACM has been giving some thought to, and particularly when should you intervene and how do you intervene?
Yeah, thank you very much. It is indeed an area of concern for the ACM, and I think also for another national authorities, where they see mostly private equity, but not exclusively, roll-up strategies in previously fragmented industries. So where we see private equity coming up under the radar screen is in particular in childcare, in healthcare, in pet care, veterinarians, SME accountants, but also in transportation pallets. So it's not necessarily sophisticated professional services, but it is also in other fragmented industries. And let me be clear, we have nothing against private equity, and we also see the benefits of these types of investments. Often these are formerly mom and pop stores or operations, and that have a difficulty with succession, that do no longer invest in the light of that they are not having succession. And so the entry of private equity can lead to a professionalization of the industry, it can lead to investments, further innovation, and it provides different business models in a static market. So this is all good, but there is also a downside. And the downside relates back to what I said in my first intervention, was that we have the feeling, and somewhat more than a feeling, that there are also a number of cases where it leads immediately to price increases. And there was a recent study done by the Finnish Competition Authority where they showed that after private equity moved into the vet business and started acquiring veterinary practices, that prices rose almost immediately by 15 to 20%. And that is something that should be of concern to competition authorities, because it could definitely be, and these transactions were not checked because they fell under the radar of the Finnish Competition Authority. So first concern, of course, is that this could be the result of unchecked market power, and therefore we need to change our jurisdictional threshold so that we can somehow be able to review these types of mergers. And if we find and if we believe that it leads to market power, then we can stop private equity companies gobbling up these small practices. Second, it could also be, of course, that private equity is kind of more able to exploit information asymmetry, and that they have just more sophisticated tools and stronger financial incentives to use that information asymmetry. And that is not maybe in essence a competition issue, but it is an issue that is of concern to consumer protection agencies and to the government as such, and may justify intervention. And then finally, the third element, which is somewhat related to the information asymmetry, but not necessarily. Think about bringing your pet to a vet, so get that picture right. Your willingness to pay is pretty high. And maybe that old-fashioned vet, was not charging to your willingness to pay, but had some sort of kind of professional code or honor, or to say, well, okay, I'll make an exception for you, or we'll be reasonable. I mean, you can imagine these kind of in more traditional industries where these types of incentives still occur. Well, now fast forward where private equity moves in, and obviously with a strong and logical profit incentive, tries to charge to the max. Which is their right to do if it's an unregulated industry, but it is a concern. And it is a concern that we as authorities, as the government agencies, should be worried about. And that's why we strongly believe it's important that competition authorities get the authority to look at these types of transactions, and if they lead to market power, stop them. Second, that we get a power which is, kind of coined as the new competition tool, in order, if we see that competition is not functioning, that we are able to kind of to restart, strengthen competition by kind of regulatory, quasi-regulatory competition interventions. And finally, but that is obviously not for the competition authority, even with a new competition tool, is that regulatory intervention may be necessary in some of these markets, particularly those markets where consumer interests are at stake, where and where directly the consumer is affected. Again, think about bringing your pet to a vet which is owned by a profit-maximizing private equity firm. I mean, I think everyone feels with me that, that is a dangerous situation where, you have to think as a government, do you want this and how can we regulate this?
Just coming back to you on that last one, Martin, I thought you might say that that's an area where consumer enforcement, or where you're worried about asymmetrical treatment or exploiting uncertainty or something along those lines. But it sounds like you're saying that there may be some markets where profit maximizing is just not very attractive. Is that basically what you're saying?
Yeah, indeed. I think, first of all, we have to think, okay, can competition solve it? So I think that is still competition believer at heart. So if competition can solve it, then let's do that. But if that leads to outcomes that are basically unacceptable in society, and that leads to what's something that we now see, or, at least where we receive the first reports, that people in financial vulnerable situations are reluctant to have and to own a pet because they're afraid for the cost that may occur. I mean, that is not the situation that we want. And then, even if competition leads to, if there is no market power and competition leads to prices with this effect, I think we have to go back again to the drawing board and decide, well, maybe competition is not the best way to keep market forces under control, and stronger intervention is necessary.
Thank you. Nathan, perhaps you can provide your thoughts on where the US is in this area. And again, I'm conscious that the merger guidelines have a whole section on roll-ups now, so clearly it's been something that you've given a lot of thought to. But also, what are your private equity, I know, has been a topic that's been discussed quite a lot in the US as well.
No question. Like you said, private equity, roll-ups in particular, big focus for this commission. I expect that to continue going forward with the incoming administration. I think state AGs tend to be very interested in this type of activity. Healthcare markets are oftentimes local. It's an obvious area of focus for state enforcers as well. Like you said, Guideline 8 of the 2023 merger guidelines is the roll-up guideline. It says when a merger is part of a series of multiple acquisitions, the agencies may examine the whole series. Pretty straightforward. We have a big ongoing case against U.S. Anesthesiology Partners. That's a monopolization case, but the core allegation is that USAP and its private equity backer basically bought up every large anesthesiology practice in Texas. They did more than a dozen acquisitions over the span of 8 years, and that it created market power and had all types of ill market power effects. I will say this, though. What we see in roll-ups is not limited to private equity and not limited to healthcare. We had a matter recently in modular storage where the A side was strategic, but where the evidence was really pretty overwhelming, both that this firm was pursuing a roll-up strategy, but also about the price and non-price effects of that strategy. So again, there's a focus on healthcare. There's been a focus on healthcare at the Commission for not as long as the Commission has existed, but 4 decades. And it's a focus, but just to say you can see roll-up activity in non-healthcare markets certainly too. Look, I think we have the legal tools. I think detection is a challenge. I think some of the revisions to the HSR form will help us greatly there, but detection is a real issue. Remedy is a real issue as well, unscrambling the eggs. To the extent you do a series of below the threshold mergers, we may detect it if it's 5, 6, 8 years after the fact. How do you go about unscrambling the egg? How do you deal with the fact that they presumably or very well may have exercised market power in the interim? So there are real challenges. I think our legal framework is strong. I think, again, detection and remedy are meaningful challenges on the roll-up front.
Thank you, Nathan. Mike, very quickly, the UK has a different framework in the sense that you don't really have, well, you do have a share of supply test, although that share of supply test has been used very flexibly to give you jurisdiction when you need it. I mean, going back to my distant past in the UK authority, I remember doing a whole bunch of small local bus mergers where the concern was that one of the bus companies was just taking over route by route by route and getting a monopoly across all these routes. Is this an area of concern that you see in the UK, that there's a gap, and do you have similar concerns like Martin was articulated in private equity?
So we don't have that gap because, as you say, we have the share supply test and we can always define a local market. Do I have similar concerns to Martin? I do. I agree completely with Nathan. They're not just private equity concerns. So if we look, we have similar concerns to Martin in the vet market where we've had these roll-up strategies by 6 firms. 3 are private equity, 3 aren't private equity. So it's not a private equity issue. The one other thing I would add is just generally this idea that firms can come in and break effectively implicit social contracts, so you talk about vets, maybe in funeral parlours as well, is something that I think consumer protection should be worrying about.
Thank you. And then Guillaume, finally to you, is this an area which impacts the European Commission at all, or is this really kind of like a national area, this idea of roll-ups, because it's normally small markets that are rolled up over time?
So, I mean, it's true that there's a lot of debate at the moment with NCAs. I think Martin mentioned also Finland, and I think that's one of the reasons for them to ask for a call-in, and we may discuss this issue again. I think where we start from, as you know, from an EU perspective, we don't have these powers to go back, 2 years before. What matters is the tipping point. So you look at a merger and what the change, is what kind of change is triggered by the merger, taking into account the market as it stands, and then you intervene or not. There's a big exception to that is the capacity we have to look at serial acquisitions between the same undertakings, and we had an important case on that in the pharma industry at the time, in GSK Novartis, where we intervened actually, and one of the transactions was below the thresholds. It's a very specific set of circumstances just to show that it wasn't about private equity, but about pharma. Now, when we have mergers that come after a series of other mergers, we had the cases where we saw that there was a series of acquisitions before. Obviously, that market reality we take into account. I mean, Solvay is one of these cases where it was, the tipping point. I think Kingspan Trimo is another one. But it's fair to say that we don't have that type of approach like the US authorities, bearing in mind that we have one other enforcement gap just to facilitate the transition.
Yeah. And maybe you can touch very briefly on that enforcement
if I need to.
the Illumina Grail judgment. In the last kind of 3-4 minutes, I'll give you the last word here, because Illumina Grail decisions clearly put an end to member states to refer upwards to the EC on cases where they don't have jurisdiction and the EC doesn't have jurisdiction. How is that gap going to be filled, or is there a plan to fill that gap? It's already been talked about by the Commissioner this morning, very touched on.
Okay.
She mentioned it. So what's the plan for that?
What's the plan? Well, the issue is on the table. I think there's a consensus. You've seen that at political level for competition authorities and the Commission in particular to address that gap. I think the court gave us, two potential way forward. One is to change the legislation, and the other one is to let member states, adapt their own thresholds or safeguard mechanism or competence criteria. At the moment, I think we are in that reality. I think for reasons that are linked both to the discussion around killer acquisitions and similar issues around innovative firms, small targets. I think there's an appetite in many member states, reminding everyone that the vast majority of member states supported the proportionate approach under 22, but that's that's well known. And I think I think in many member states you see that there's this appetite to have a call-in power, but also to address other issues that I think Martijn talked about. So it's not necessarily just to trigger a referral. It's also to look at some cases that at the moment are going below the radar. So that's one reality. We need to see whether that reality will be effective. We have one ongoing case that has come through the exercise of a call-in power by Italy, the NVIDIA Run AI. So we're looking at that case, and irrespective of the outcome, at least we got the capacity to look at it. But that's a bit of a paradox of the judgment that indeed now, you will see, I think that's very understandable appetite for member states to call in transactions because they thought they had the right under EU law, which they have been deprived from. So I think that's one paradox. There are many others, but I don't have time to comment. So I think the reality is that we may see the very same transaction being potentially reviewed in several call-in member states, which will trigger potentially also pre-notification referrals, because under 4.5, if you have the ability to review a transaction, then companies can come to us directly and notify voluntarily. We had this experience in a Google case, actually the one I mentioned earlier, an IBM case. So that might be, a new area where we might see, if you want more legal certainty, come to us and we will look at the case. So that might be one avenue. And the other option is change the merger regulation, which, as you know, is not a mince affaire. It's something that is, deserves some thought on what you want to do, because there are many different ways of finding a threshold. What type of thresholds? There's the deal value threshold in Germany with pros and cons, but there's also the option of what we call the any means any option, which means that any concentration under 22 can be referred. So we would have to clarify that any means any, as we thought. And that would be one way to reform the merger regulation in a recital, whatever, so that it's very clear that the legislator wanted us to review the transactions as it thought it should in the DMA, because you know that in Article 14 of the DMA, the legislator underlined the need to inform about cases for the purpose of an Article 22 So that's another paradox, but this is a long story.
A long story which unfortunately we don't have fully time for. I'm going to bring this panel to a close and thank all my panel guests. We've had a tour de force of the hot topics in mergers recently, including one of the very ongoing cases, so thank you from Mike for very gamely talking about that. And I hope you'll agree with me how illuminating it's been, and eventually we'll find the holy grail of good merger regulation. Thank you very much.